12-year-old Maggie thought the worst thing she'd have to deal with in middle school was the usual bullying, but nothing could have prepared her for the horrors inflicted on her by Jason Darcy and his friends. The boys' attack on Maggie is more than just cruel. It's vicious and life-changing. Determined not to be another silent victim, Maggie teams up with her best friend Maria to get revenge, secretly filming the boys in the act. But as they dig deeper, they discover that Jason's powerful family is hiding dark, twisted secrets that threaten to destroy more than just their lives. What started as a desperate act of justice quickly spirals into a dangerous game, where every move puts Maggie and Maria in greater danger, and they're running out of time to uncover the truth before it's too late. Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy the story. Now let's get started. Maggie sat at the edge of the schoolyard, absent-mindedly twirling a loose thread from her jumper as she watched a group of girls giggle near the swings. She wasn't exactly part of that crowd, but she wasn't excluded either. In the unspoken hierarchy of middle school, Maggie drifted somewhere in the middle, neither fully invisible nor painfully noticed. Her best friend Maria often made that fact bearable. Unlike most of the other girls, Maria stood by Maggie without judgment. They were two sides of the same coin, with Maria's mixed-race background often bringing unwanted attention from boys who were intrigued by her long curls and olive-toned skin. "Hey, you still coming over tonight?" Maria nudged her, snapping Maggie from her thoughts. "Yeah, of course," Maggie replied, offering a small smile. She always looked forward to sleepovers at Maria's house. Not just because of the break from her own life at home, but because Maria's older sister, Caroline, had a way of telling stories that made every bit of gossip sound like it was pulled from the pages of a mystery novel. By the time the final school bell rang, Maggie and Maria were already plotting their usual late-night antics. Caroline usually let them stay up later than their parents ever would, and they often spent those hours watching scary movies or whispering about the older boys in school, who rarely gave them the time of day. That evening, after pizza and a bit of homework, Caroline slipped into the room, her face lit with a sly grin that sent a wave of excitement through the girls. "Have you two heard what happened with Jason Darcy?" Caroline asked, lowering her voice as if the walls had ears. Jason Darcy was a name everyone in the school knew, and not just because of his good looks and wealthy family. He was popular, but there was always something off about him. Something that left a bad taste in the air whenever his name came up. "No. What happened?" Maggie asked, leaning in closer. Caroline's eyes sparkled with the thrill of being the first to share the juicy gossip. "He got caught, but guess what? Nothing's gonna happen to him. He installed secret cameras in the girls' locker room. The police found out, but there wasn't even an arrest. His family must have paid them off." Maggie and Maria's jaws dropped. "Cameras? In the locker room?" Maria asked, horrified. Maggie's heart pounded as Caroline nodded, confirming their worst fears. "Yep. Creepy, right? I'm telling you, money can buy anything, even someone's dignity." The girls stayed up late, unable to shake the idea that someone they went to school with could do something so horrible and get away with it. They whispered about it for hours, trying to piece together how the police could just drop it. Maggie and Maria were especially fixated on the injustice, feeling an unsettling mix of curiosity and fear. Later, as they lay in the dark, Maggie couldn't stop thinking about it. She was furious that someone like Jason could escape punishment. How many other things had he gotten away with? "We should try to see if there's anything left," Maria suggested suddenly. "Like what?" Maggie asked, already knowing the answer. "Cameras. What if he hid more?" The Monday following the sleepover came around faster than Maggie would have liked. Though the weekend had been filled with laughter, the weight of the story Maria's sister had shared still lingered in her mind. As Maggie walked to school that morning, her thoughts swirled around Jason Darcy, the locker room cameras, and how such an invasive act could have gone unpunished. How did someone like Jason, who appeared so untouchable, get away with something so cruel? It wasn't just the act of placing the cameras, it was the fact that there were no consequences, no justice. His wealth and power had clearly shielded him, and it infuriated her. When Maggie arrived at school, she spotted Maria by the lockers. "Hey, ready for PE today?" Maria asked with a grin, but Maggie's expression was far more serious. "Do you think there's still cameras in the locker room?" Maggie asked as they began walking toward their class. Maria paused, realizing that Maggie had been holding on to the story since the sleepover. "I don't know. I mean, the police investigated, right?" Maria shrugged, though her tone betrayed a hint of unease. The thought had crossed her mind, too. Jason and his friends seemed to get away with a lot, even more than typical popular boys. The fear of what they might still be doing in the shadows was unsettling. PE class came around after lunch, and Maggie and Maria decided to stick to their plan of checking the locker room for any signs of hidden cameras. The other girls were busy changing and chatting, not paying attention to the two friends as they quietly inspected the corners and walls. At first, it seemed like they wouldn't find anything. Everything appeared normal. But when the electricity flickered and the overhead lights momentarily shut off, the darkness revealed something neither of them expected: a faint, flashing red light in the far corner of the ceiling. Maria's eyes widened. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing upward. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. They stared at the small flashing light, and a wave of fear washed over them both. There was no doubt about it. It was a camera. Someone was still watching. They looked around at the other girls, still unaware, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong. Maggie felt sick. She grabbed Maria's hand and whispered, "We need to get out of here." The two girls hurriedly changed back into their uniforms and left the locker room, their minds racing. What should they do? They couldn't just leave the camera there, knowing it was recording everything. But who could they tell? Could they even trust the teachers, knowing that nothing had been done about Jason last time? "I think we need to tell someone," Maggie said, her voice trembling as they walked down the hall. Maria nodded. "But who? The police couldn't even do anything before." Maggie hesitated. "What about our parents? Maybe they'll listen." That afternoon, they made a pact. They would tell their parents everything, from the story about Jason's previous cameras to their discovery of the new one. And maybe this time, someone would take action. Maggie and Maria walked home from school together that afternoon, their nerves still on edge from what they had discovered in the locker room. The fear of what they had seen weighed heavily on their young minds. They had talked about it nonstop since leaving school, running over every possible scenario of what might happen next. The girls made their way to Maggie's house first, where they planned to tell Maggie's mom everything. As they walked through the front door, Maggie's mother, Sherry, looked up from the kitchen table. She was always home after school, prepping for dinner, and today was no different. She smiled at the girls, but the expression faded quickly as she saw the concern written all over their faces. "Maggie, Maria, what's going on? You two look like you've seen a ghost." Maggie's eyes darted to Maria for support before she spoke. "Mom, we need to tell you something. It's about school and Jason Darcy." At the mention of Jason's name, Sherry's face hardened. She knew the name all too well. Jason's family was known around town, mostly for their money and influence. The fact that he had already been involved in a scandal at the school wasn't new to Sherry, but she had hoped, like most parents, that the situation had been dealt with. "What about Jason Darcy?" Sherry asked, her voice firm but calm, sensing that something serious had happened. Maggie took a deep breath. No, we know there's still a camera in the locker room. We saw it today. There's a flashing red light. Mom, someone is still recording the girls." For a moment, Sherry didn't say anything. Her face went pale, her mind clearly processing what Maggie had just told her. Then her expression changed. It was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and concern all wrapped into one. "You saw it yourselves? Are you sure?" Maggie nodded, glancing at Maria, who confirmed it as well. "We both saw it. It was hidden, but when the power went out, the light from the camera flashed." Sherry stood up, pacing the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I'm calling the police. We're not letting this slide." She quickly grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter, dialing the local station. Maggie's heart raced as she watched her mother make the call. Maria was quiet during the entire conversation, feeling a pit form in her stomach as Sherry recounted their discovery to the dispatcher. By the time she hung up, it was official. The police would be coming to take a statement, and they wanted to see the locker room themselves the next morning. When Maria finally went home, Maggie felt a small sense of relief, knowing that the police would be involved. But that relief was short-lived. Later that evening, after dinner, Maggie was in her room scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from everything that had happened that day. She clicked through her Instagram feed, idly liking photos, when she noticed a new message request. Maggie rarely got direct messages from people she didn't know, so she was curious. She clicked the notification, and her curiosity quickly turned to dread. The message was short and simple: 35 Rainway Drive. Her address, it was from an account she didn't recognize, and there was no other message. Maggie's heart stopped. How did they know where she lived? Panic surged through her. She dropped her phone and rushed down the stairs to find her mom. "Mom! Mom!" Maggie called out, her voice shaking. Sherry came into the living room, concern in her eyes. "What's wrong, Maggie?" Maggie held out her phone, her hand trembling as she showed her mother the message. Sherry's face immediately turned serious, a deep frown forming as she read the message. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know. I've never seen this account before," Maggie whispered. The weight of the message was sinking in, her anxiety rising by the second. "Mom, I'm scared," Sherry nodded, her face determined. "Let me handle this, Maggie. I'm going to call the police again." Just as Sherry reached for her phone, Maggie's own phone buzzed again in her hand. Another message request, this time from a different username. Maggie hesitated before opening it. It was Maria. "Did you get the message?" The text read, "I got the same thing. My address." Maggie's heart dropped. She quickly called Maria, her voice shaky. "Maria, I got the same message. How do they know where we live?" Maria's voice was equally panicked. "I don't know. My sister's freaking out. She said this was a bad idea, going after Jason like this. We shouldn't have messed with him." Maggie heard the fear in her friend's voice. Maria's older sister, who had always been protective of her, was now panicking in the background, saying something about how powerful Jason's family was. "You don't know what they can do, Maria. You don't mess with people like them," her sister shouted, her voice carrying through the phone. Maggie could feel her chest tightening. "Maria, what are we going to do?" "I don't know. Come over. Maybe we'll feel safer together," Maria suggested. Maggie agreed and quickly grabbed her coat, telling her mom where she was going. Sherry looked hesitant, but she understood the gravity of the situation. "I'll drive you. We're not taking any chances tonight." As Maggie and her mom headed to Maria's house, Maggie's mind raced. What had they gotten themselves into? She thought they were doing the right thing, but now it felt like they had unleashed something far worse. As the car pulled up in front of Maria's house, Maggie couldn't shake the creeping paranoia that someone was watching them even now. Every shadow, every movement outside the window seemed suspicious. Maggie and Maria huddled in Maria's room that night, trying to distract themselves with movies and snacks, but neither could shake the fear. There were no more messages, but the silence didn't bring any comfort. Instead, it made the fear sink in even more, like the calm before a storm. The next few days were a blur of nerves and tension. Maggie and Maria barely spoke about anything other than the camera, the messages, and the looming presence of Jason Darcy. Every time they saw him in the hallways at school, his eyes seemed to follow them, cold and calculating. They had gone to the police, handed over the camera they found, and explained everything in detail. The officers took their statements seriously, but there was a sense of helplessness in their follow-up. It wasn't enough to ease the girls' fears. The police assured them that an investigation was underway, but with Jason's family wealth and influence, they both had doubts. Even though the girls had reported everything, they couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Then came the day when everything changed. It was a Thursday, one of those days that felt like it was dragging on forever. Maggie's stomach had been in knots all day, and even though she hadn't mentioned it to Maria, she was having trouble focusing on anything. The feeling of being watched was getting worse with each passing day, and it gnawed at her from the inside out. But after school, the usual routine was supposed to bring some sense of normalcy. Maggie walked home from school, taking her usual route along the back streets, the shortcut that led past a half-finished construction site. It was quieter than usual. No other kids were walking around, and the streets felt eerily deserted. As she turned the corner toward the construction site, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Suddenly, from behind, she heard the sound of footsteps, quick, heavy footsteps. Before Maggie could even register what was happening, hands grabbed her backpack, yanking her backward with such force that she nearly fell to the ground. She gasped, turning around, and saw them, Jason Darcy and his group of friends, all with sinister grins plastered across their faces. The tallest boy, Ben, tightened his grip on her backpack and pushed her toward the others. "What's the rush, Maggie?" Jason sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. His eyes were cold, and the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. She stumbled backward, fear flooding her veins as her heart pounded in her chest. Maggie's voice trembled as she spoke. "What do you want?" Jason chuckled darkly. "Oh, I think you know. You and your little friend have been causing a lot of trouble lately. Cameras? Going to the cops? That's not very smart." Maggie's throat was dry, her pulse racing. She wanted to run, to scream for help, but the fear rooted her in place. She tried to step back, but Jason's friends closed in, surrounding her. There was no escape. The boys towered over her, creating a circle that felt like a trap. "Please, just leave me alone," Maggie begged, her voice cracking. But they didn't care. Jason took a step closer, his face inches from hers now. The scent of his cologne mixed with the smell of dirt and concrete from the construction site, making Maggie's stomach churn. "You're going to tell your parents to drop the charges," Jason whispered, his voice menacing. "Do you understand? You don't want to mess with my family." The other boys laughed, as if this were all a game, as if Maggie's fear was amusing to them. Tears began to pool in her eyes, blurring her vision. She couldn't stop them from falling, no matter how hard she tried to stay strong. She couldn't let them see how terrified she was, but it was too late. The tears flowed freely now, and her sobs broke through her chest. Jason tilted his head, mocking her. "What's the matter, Maggie? Afraid?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot on her face. "Drop the charges." The boys started chanting it, over and over again. "Drop the charges! Drop the charges!" Their voices grew louder and more aggressive, echoing off the walls of the empty construction site. Maggie felt like she was suffocating, her panic rising as their taunts filled her ears. They pushed her back and forth between them like she was nothing, like she was a toy. Finally, Jason grabbed her by the arm and yanked her toward him, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. "Say it! Say you'll drop the charges." Okay, Maggie screamed, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'll drop them. Just stop." The boys laughed, their mission accomplished. Jason released her arm and shoved her backward, sending her stumbling to the ground. Her backpack slid off her shoulders, and she hit the dirt hard, her hands scraping against the rough ground. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling uncontrollably as she curled into herself, trying to hold back the sobs. Jason crouched down beside her, lifting her chin so that their eyes met. His expression was cold, devoid of any humanity. "Remember this next time you think about crossing me," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning if you don't do as you're told." Maggie didn't respond. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, the fear too overwhelming to allow her to say anything. Jason stood up, dusting off his hands, and motioned to his friends to follow him. But before they left, one of the boys, Derek, the cruelest of the group, reached down and grabbed the sleeve of Maggie's school jumper, yanking on it until the fabric tore. The boys erupted into laughter as they walked away, leaving Maggie on the ground, humiliated and shaken. When they were finally out of sight, Maggie remained where she was for a moment, trying to collect herself. Her mind was racing, her body still trembling with fear. She struggled to pull herself together, wiping her tear-streaked face with her sleeve, but her heart was still pounding in her chest. Finally, she fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Maria's number. The phone rang once, twice, no answer. Maggie's panic surged again. "Come on, Maria, pick up!" Maggie muttered, her voice shaking. She called again, and again there was no answer. The fear was unbearable now. What if Jason and his friends had already gotten to Maria? "Please, Maria," she whispered, dialing once more. Her hands shook violently as the phone continued to ring, and each unanswered call sent fresh waves of terror coursing through her. Finally, she gave up on calling and scrambled to her feet. She had to get to Maria's house, now. Without even thinking, she sprinted down the street, her feet pounding the pavement as she raced to her best friend's house. Her mind was a blur of fear and desperation, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she finally reached Maria's house, she didn't even bother knocking. She burst through the front door, her heart in her throat. "Maria, are you here?" Maria came rushing out of the kitchen, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. "Maggie, what's going on? What happened?" Maggie collapsed into Maria's arms, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. The tears she had tried so hard to hold back came flooding out, and between sobs she told Maria everything, about the boys, the threats, the attack at the construction site. Maria's face paled, and she gripped Maggie tightly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now, Maggie. You're here with me." But even as Maria held her, Maggie couldn't shake the dread in her stomach. She had escaped for now, but Jason wasn't done with them. This was far from over. Maggie and Maria spent the weekend going over the attack and Jason Darcy's threats. The incident played out in their heads over and over, like a nightmare on repeat. Maria had become even more anxious, checking her phone constantly and barely able to sleep. Maggie was just as paranoid, wondering if they were being watched or followed, even in the safety of their homes. It was unbearable. Sunday evening came, and Maria suddenly blurted out, "We need to fight back." Maggie's eyes widened. "What do you mean? I'm not going near those psychos again." "No, not like that," Maria said, pacing around the room. "We need to catch them, like, really catch them, on camera." Maggie hesitated, but she could see the logic. The boys were bold and reckless. But how? Maria grabbed her phone and started searching online. "We'll set a trap, just like how we found that camera in the locker room, but this time we'll put a camera of our own where they ambushed you." Maggie's heart raced as she caught on to the plan. "We can catch them in the act, get their threats and everything on video." "Exactly," Maria said, her eyes sharp with focus. "We'll get the proof we need, and then they won't be able to deny anything. Even Jason's rich family can't cover this up." The girls talked through the night, thinking of every possible way to execute their plan. By Monday morning, they'd ordered a small security camera online, planning to hide it at the construction site where the boys had ambushed Maggie. The idea was risky, but they were desperate and angry. Maria was scared but determined. "They think they can mess with us just because they're rich and have connections. Let's see how tough they are when the police have their threats on tape." That week was torture. Every school day felt like it stretched for hours. Maggie avoided the boys as much as possible, and thankfully, they hadn't approached her again since the incident. Maybe they thought they'd scared her enough, or maybe they were plotting something new. She shivered at the thought. On Friday afternoon, the camera arrived, and they were ready. Maria and Maggie rushed to her house after school to set everything up. The camera was small, barely noticeable, and easy to hide. It came with motion sensors, ensuring it would capture anything that happened at the construction site. Just like they had planned. Maggie looked at it nervously. "Are we really doing this?" Maria nodded firmly. "Yes, we're not backing down. We're going to catch those guys, and they'll pay for what they did." The next morning, they set out to the construction site early, before anyone else was around. The area was still quiet, abandoned for the weekend, which worked in their favor. They found a corner with some broken crates and debris where they could place the camera. Maria knelt down and carefully hid the device underneath some rubble, angling it so it would cover the area where the boys had dragged Maggie. It blended into the mess perfectly. "Okay, that's it," Maria whispered, standing up and dusting her hands off. "Now, we wait." They left the construction site, walking fast, trying to keep calm, but the adrenaline was high. The trap was set. But the girls had no idea just how dangerous their plan would be. That night, after a long, restless evening filled with fear and paranoia, Maggie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The shadows danced in her room, but all she could think about was the ominous message she had received. It was too much to bear. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and opened the message from the unknown user. The unsettling chill from before crept over her once again as she stared at her address glowing on the screen. What were they trying to accomplish? It felt like a threat, an intimidation tactic meant to keep her silent. Taking a deep breath, Maggie decided she had to respond. She wasn't going to let them scare her. She needed them to know she was not afraid, and she was not backing down. With newfound determination, she typed a quick message, "I'm not dropping anything." She hit send, her heart racing. She knew it was risky, but she had to stand up for herself. With that one message, she felt a flicker of control return. Whatever was happening, she was not going to be silenced. After sending the message, Maggie tossed and turned in her bed, waiting for a reply. Every ping of her phone sent her heart into her throat, but nothing came. She eventually fell asleep, the tension of the day still coiling in her stomach. The next morning brought a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. As the sun filtered through her curtains, Maggie felt the familiar weight of fear hovering over her. But today, they had a plan, and that made everything feel a little more manageable. Maggie rushed through her morning routine, grabbing her backpack and slipping on her shoes. As she opened the front door to leave, she spotted Maria waiting by the gate, a playful grin on her face. "Ready for our detective work?" Maria called out, her voice brightening Maggie's mood. "Absolutely. Sherlock and Watson reporting for duty." Maggie replied, trying to match Maria's enthusiasm. Maria laughed as they walked towards each other, the weight of their fears momentarily lifted by the camaraderie they shared. "Which one of us is which?" she asked, tilting her head playfully. Maggie feigned deep contemplation. "Well, I think I'm definitely Sherlock. I mean, who else would be the genius behind this brilliant plan?" She gestured grandly to the air. Maria rolled her eyes, but her smile didn't falter. "Oh, please, you're just being modest. I think I'm more of a Sherlock. You're the one who almost cried at the thought of a secret camera." Maggie laughed, shaking her head. "Okay, fine. But only if you admit that Watson is way cooler than you think." "Deal. But just for today," Maria conceded with a mock seriousness that made Maggie laugh even harder. They continued to banter as they walked to school, but beneath the playful surface, the anxiety was palpable. Every car that drove by felt like it was watching them. Every shadow made them jump. But together, they felt a little braver. Once they arrived at school, Maggie felt her stomach twist again. The halls buzzed with the usual chatter, but the familiar faces of their classmates suddenly seemed menacing. She scanned the crowd, half expecting to see Jason and his friends lurking nearby, but there was no sign of them. "Let's just act normal," Maria whispered, linking her arm with Maggie's as they made their way to their first class. "No one needs to know what we're up to." "Agreed," Maggie replied, though it was hard to shake off the feeling that something was about to happen. During lunch, the girls found a quiet table in the corner, away from the noisy throng of students. They huddled close, whispering about their plan. Maggie felt a rush of adrenaline course through her veins as they discussed their strategy for the afternoon. "After school, we'll head straight to the construction site," Maggie said, her voice low but firm. "If we're lucky, we'll catch them." Maria nodded, biting her lip in anticipation. "And if they don't show up?" Maggie shrugged, trying to sound confident. "Then we'll have to figure out another way to make sure they know we're not afraid." The rest of the school day passed in a blur. The tension hung thick in the air, and Maggie found it hard to concentrate on her classes. All she could think about was the trap they were setting and the unknown dangers that lay ahead. Finally, the last bell rang, releasing them from the prison of anxiety and fear that had settled over them all day. They rushed out of the building, excitement and dread bubbling within them as they made their way toward the construction site. As they walked, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows along the pavement. They felt a mix of nervousness and exhilaration, like detectives on the brink of a major breakthrough. "Hey, Sherlock," Maria said, nudging Maggie playfully. "You ready for this?" "Ready as I'll ever be, Watson," Maggie replied, a grin spreading across her face despite the tension in her chest. With determination in their hearts, they made their way to the construction site, fully aware that whatever happened next would change everything. Maggie and Maria took a deep breath as they approached the same route where Maggie had been attacked just days before. It felt surreal to walk the same path, a strange mixture of determination and dread coursing through their veins. This was the moment they had prepared for, but as they neared the construction site, Maggie's heart raced with fear. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We have to make them see us," Maggie replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "They need to know we're not afraid anymore." As they reached the familiar spot, the boys' laughter echoed through the air. The tension thickened, and the girls exchanged a resolute glance. They were ready to stand their ground, armed with their hidden cameras, ready to record everything that happened next. The moment the boys emerged from their hiding place, the atmosphere shifted. Jason led the pack, a predatory grin spreading across his face as he locked eyes with the girls. "There they are!" he shouted, his voice dripping with malice. The boys surged forward, surrounding Maggie and Maria with a sense of menace that made the air crackle with danger. "Look who we have here," one of Jason's friends taunted, shoving Maggie hard. She stumbled, barely managing to keep her footing. "Thought you could play detective, huh?" Jason sneered, pushing Maria with such force that she fell to the ground. Maggie's heart raced as she watched her best friend struggle to get back up, fear gnawing at her insides. "Leave her alone!" Maggie shouted, trying to step between them, but the boys were relentless, pulling their hair and laughing cruelly. "Ah, what's wrong? You scared?" Jason mocked, spitting on the ground in front of them. Maggie felt a rush of anger surge through her. They were filming it all, the evidence piling up, but it came at a price she hadn't fully grasped. The boys were rougher than before, pushing them down, yanking at their clothes. Maggie felt the fabric of her shirt rip as they tore at it, their laughter ringing in her ears like a sinister song. The recording continued, but with every insult and shove, Maggie's resolve wavered. The boys' threats echoed through her mind, each word more chilling than the last. But this time felt different. There was a seriousness in their voices that made her blood run cold. "What's the matter? Did you think you could get away with it?" Jason said, his eyes glinting with a cruel light. "We saw you yesterday, you know. We saw you set up that little camera." Maggie's heart dropped. The realization crashed over her like a wave. They had followed them. They had known everything. Jason chuckled darkly. "One of my boys put it back in the girls' locker room after you left. Hope you enjoy your little game." Fear twisted in Maggie's stomach, and the urge to flee overwhelmed her. "We need to go," she shouted, grabbing Maria's arm. They turned to run, but the boys were faster, blocking their escape. "Not so fast," Jason hissed, stepping closer. "Know what? I'll let you girls go if the pretty one gives me a kiss." He reached out toward Maria, a twisted smile on his face. "Get away from her!" Maggie yelled, feeling a surge of protective instinct. Maria recoiled, turning her head away as Jason lunged for her, desperation etched across her face. Just as the situation escalated further, a deafening gunshot rang out through the air. The boys froze, their faces shifting from amusement to shock as they turned toward the sound. Maria's sister, along with 5 police officers, had arrived just in time. One officer had fired a warning shot into the air, intervening with precision and authority. "Get back! Step away from the girls!" Maria's sister shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The boys hesitated, the bravado draining from their faces as they realized they were no longer in control. Maggie and Maria didn't wait for a second invitation. They dashed toward Maria's sister, relief flooding through them as they were enveloped in her protective embrace. The officers moved in, quickly detaining Jason and his friends, the weight of their earlier threats finally crashing down on them. "Are you okay?" Maria's sister asked, her eyes scanning the girls for any signs of injury. "Yeah, we're fine," Maggie managed, her voice shaking. But deep down, they knew they would never be the same. The fear and uncertainty still lingered, and as they watched the boys being led away, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The adrenaline was still coursing through Maggie and Maria as they were escorted back to the police station. The chaos of the confrontation lingered in their minds, but the presence of the officers brought a semblance of safety. With each step they took, the weight of their situation settled deeper in their chests. "Are you both okay?" One of the officers asked gently, his tone reassuring. Maggie nodded, though her heart still raced. "We're fine," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Just shaken up. Maria clutched Maggie's hand tightly, her grip a reminder that they were in this together. As they entered the station, the fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting a sterile glow over the room. The air smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety, the latter evident in the faces of the officers busy at their desks. "Let's get you two checked out," another officer said, leading them to a small waiting area. They sat down, the hard plastic chairs a stark contrast to the plush comfort of their homes. Maggie could feel her heart slowing down, but her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. "I can't believe they stole our camera," Maria said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's terrible that they did all that, and we got no evidence because they took it." Maggie's lips curled into a cheeky grin. "Did they?" she said, her tone teasing as she reached into her pocket. Maria's brows knitted in confusion. "What do you mean?" Maggie pulled out a tiny second security camera she had bought, its sleek design glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I had a backup plan. This one attaches to my school jumper." Maria's eyes widened in shock and admiration. "You genius! You really are Sherlock!" They both giggled, the relief flooding back into the room as they shared a moment of camaraderie. Their laughter was infectious, echoing through the stark halls of the station. But the reality of their situation was still very much at hand. After a few minutes, a uniformed officer approached them. "We've got the boys in custody. We're going to need your statements, but first, we want to show you something." Maggie's stomach dropped as they were led into an interview room. The boys sat in a separate area, their faces sullen and defensive. Jason met Maggie's gaze and sneered, but his bravado had faded. The reality of their situation was sinking in. "Do you recognize these?" the officer said, placing a familiar object on the table between them. It was their hidden security camera, the one they had set up in the construction site. Maggie's heart raced again as she nodded. "That's ours. We put it there to record what they were doing." "And this," the officer continued, placing a second camera beside the first. "We found this one on one of the boys. It seems they've been using it as well." Maria gasped, her eyes widening. "They had another camera?" "Yes. We're still examining the footage, but it's clear this was premeditated," the officer said, looking grim. "They won't be able to talk their way out of this." Maggie felt a swell of hope rise within her. "So they're really going to be punished?" The officer nodded firmly. "Given the evidence we have and their history, they'll be facing serious charges. We won't let their families buy their way out of this." The thought of justice being served felt surreal, but it was also a reminder of how much they had risked to get to this point. They had fought for their dignity and safety, and now it seemed like it was paying off. After giving their statements, the girls were taken back to the waiting area. A few minutes later, Maria's sister entered, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Thank God you're okay," she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around both girls. "I was so worried when I got the call." "We're fine," Maggie assured her, feeling comforted by her sister's presence. "The police have everything under control." Maria's sister nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced toward the boys. "I can't believe those little monsters thought they could get away with this." Maggie exchanged a glance with Maria, who smiled back at her, a shared understanding passing between them. They had stood up against the boys, and now they were safe. The officers soon returned to inform them that the boys were being transported to juvenile detention. They were officially under arrest for their actions, and there was no amount of money their families could pay to sweep this under the rug. "Your bravery won't go unnoticed," one of the officers said as they prepared to leave. "We'll keep you updated on the case, but for now, it's important that you take care of yourselves." As they left the station, the weight on Maggie's shoulders began to lift. She turned to Maria, who looked both relieved and exhausted. "Can you believe it? They're actually going to face consequences," Maggie said, her voice bubbling with disbelief. "I know. I can't believe we did this," Maria replied, a wide grin spreading across her face. "I mean, we're like actual detectives now." They both laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street as they walked toward home. It felt good to know that they had taken a stand and that their actions had resulted in real change. They were no longer just passive victims. They had become agents of their own safety. That evening, as they sat in Maria's living room, the reality of the day settled in. They had faced their fears, recorded the truth, and brought those who had wronged them to justice. "Hey, do you think we'll get to see the footage from the other camera?" Maria asked, excitement dancing in her eyes. "I hope so," Maggie replied. "I want to see those boys squirm when they realize they can't hide anymore." Their laughter filled the room, a sound of victory and newfound strength. They had turned their fear into action, and together they had carved a path towards safety and justice. As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow through the window, Maggie felt a sense of hope wash over her. They had faced darkness, but now, with each passing day, they were moving toward the light. Days passed, and the air around Maggie and Maria felt lighter, almost buoyant. Their bravery had led to justice, and for the first time in a long while, they could walk through the halls of their school without feeling the weight of constant fear. The tension from their encounter with Jason and his friends had dissipated, replaced with a sense of triumph. They were back to focusing on their studies, laughing with classmates, and daydreaming about the future. Maggie sat with Maria at lunch one afternoon, the cafeteria buzzing with the usual noise of teenagers chatting and laughing. They shared a plate of fries, giggling over a silly TikTok video Maria had seen the night before. "Can you believe we actually caught those boys?" Maria said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's like something out of a movie." "I know," Maggie replied, grinning from ear to ear. "I keep waiting for someone to tell us we're dreaming or something. I mean, who thought we could do all that?" Their laughter echoed through the cafeteria, drawing the attention of a few classmates who glanced their way with smiles. For the first time in ages, Maggie felt a surge of confidence. They had taken control of their narrative, and it felt incredible. But as the school day wore on, a strange tension began to weave itself back into the atmosphere. Whispers filled the hallways, and students exchanged worried glances. The joy that had bubbled up only days before seemed to deflate as a heavy cloud settled over the school. Then came the announcement over the loudspeaker. "Attention, students. We need everyone to remain calm and stay in your classrooms. There is an ongoing situation involving the police. Please do not leave your rooms until further notice." Maggie's heart raced as she exchanged a concerned look with Maria. "What's going on?" she whispered, anxiety creeping back into her voice. "I don't know," Maria replied, her brow furrowed, "but it doesn't sound good." After what felt like an eternity, an officer knocked on their classroom door and entered, his expression serious. "We need to ask you all to remain quiet," he instructed. "We're conducting an investigation regarding the recent events at the school." Maggie's stomach twisted as the officer's words hung in the air. The memory of their encounter with Jason flooded back, and a sense of dread settled in her bones. As they sat in the classroom, time seemed to stretch on. Finally, the officer returned. "We've received some alarming information. Over the last few days, we've found several more cameras in the girls' locker room. However, we have also discovered cameras hidden in the girls' bathrooms. The school has been turned into a crime scene." Maggie felt her breath hitch in her throat. "What?" she whispered, horrified. "More cameras?" "Yes," the officer confirmed, looking at the students with a stern expression. "In total, we found over 35 cameras strategically placed to capture every imaginable angle of the rooms. This is extremely serious." Gasps echoed throughout the classroom as panic rippled through the students. Maria grabbed Maggie's arm, her grip tightening as fear etched itself across her face. "This can't be happening," she murmured. "They're supposed to be in jail." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine as said, "The scariest fact is that Jason and his friends have been locked away. How could this have happened? Did someone attempt to copy him, or was it never Jason to begin with? And why did he try to silence us?" Questions swirled in Maggie's mind, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. Had they truly escaped Jason, only to find themselves caught in a web of something more sinister? The thought made her stomach churn. As the officers began to question students, Maggie and Maria exchanged worried glances. "What do we do?" Maggie asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Maria replied, her eyes wide with fear. "But we need to stick together. We've made it this far, and we can't let them get to us now." The police officers continued their investigation, interviewing students one by one, looking for any clues that could help them understand how this had happened. The once vibrant school atmosphere was now shrouded in fear, and students began to realize the gravity of their situation. When the final bell rang, the halls were eerily quiet as students filed out of their classrooms, each one buzzing with uncertainty. Maggie felt a mix of dread and anger brewing inside her. They had fought for their safety, but now it felt like they were back at square one. "Let's go home," Maria suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. As they walked home together, the weight of the day pressed heavily on their shoulders. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual sounds of children playing, replaced by an unsettling silence. Each time they heard a car pass by, Maggie felt her heart race, wondering if it was someone watching them again. Once they reached Maria's house, they collapsed onto the couch, the adrenaline of the day still coursing through their veins. "What if it's someone who wants to hurt us?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling. Maria shook her head, trying to suppress her fear. "We can't think like that. We have to trust the police to figure this out. They caught Jason, and they'll catch whoever is doing this now." But as the sun set outside, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being hunted. The weight of the unknown loomed large, and she couldn't help but feel that their fight was far from over. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," Maria said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her concern. Maggie nodded, knowing that their bond was the only thing keeping them anchored. They had survived so much together, and as long as they had each other, they would keep fighting for their safety, no matter what darkness lay ahead. That night, as darkness enveloped the town, Maggie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a movie on repeat. She felt unsettled, the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, gnawing at her. No matter how much she tried to shake it off, the anxiety clung to her like a second skin. She picked up her phone, hoping to distract herself with some mindless scrolling. As she flicked through social media posts, the familiar rhythm of her heartbeat began to slow, but that relief was short-lived. Just as she was about to put her phone down, a notification popped up. "Message request, unknown user." Her heart raced as she opened it, her curiosity battling with an instinctual dread. The first image loaded slowly, and Maggie's stomach dropped as she recognized her own figure in the grainy photo. It was a snapshot of her walking home from school, the trees lining the sidewalk framing her small silhouette. Maggie's breath quickened. How could someone be watching her? She clicked to see the next image, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. This time it was a photo of her in class, her head bent over her desk, focused on her work. Panic gripped her as she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was nearly suffocating. Before she could even gather her thoughts, the third image appeared. It was a picture of her sleeping, taken from a distance, the soft glow of her bedside lamp illuminating her face. In that moment, sheer terror washed over her, and her instincts kicked in. She screamed, the sound piercing the silence of the night. "Maggie!" Her mom called from downstairs, rushing to her room. "What's wrong?" Maggie flew out of bed, her heart racing as she bolted for the stairs. She reached the bottom and stumbled into the living room, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her parents were already standing there, concern etched on their faces. "Mom, Dad, someone is watching me," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held out her phone, the images still displayed on the screen. Her mother's eyes widened as she snatched the phone from Maggie's hands. "What do you mean someone is watching you?" It's a picture of me walking home, and in class. They even took a picture of me while I was sleeping." Maggie choked out, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "Call the police," her father commanded, his voice low and steady as he quickly dialed 911. "We need to report this right away." As her dad spoke with the dispatcher, Maggie's mom wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. "You're safe, Maggie. We're here. Nothing is going to happen to you, I promise." But Maggie felt anything but safe. The reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. Someone had invaded her space, watching her without her knowledge, and it made her skin crawl. The laughter and warmth of the day felt like a distant memory now. Within minutes, the police arrived, their presence adding a strange mix of relief and anxiety to the atmosphere. Officers knocked on the door and entered, assessing the situation with practiced professionalism. "Maggie," one of the officers said gently, "can you tell us exactly what you saw?" She nodded, her voice shaky as she recounted the messages and the photos. The officer listened attentively, taking notes while the other began searching the house for any signs of intrusions. After a thorough search of the common areas, one of the officers approached Maggie's room. "We'll need to check your bedroom as well, just to be safe," he said, his tone serious but reassuring. Maggie felt her heart race again. She couldn't shake the feeling that her room had been violated in a way she couldn't fully understand. As the officer entered her space, she followed closely behind, her breath hitching in her throat. The officer inspected every corner, moving her books and toys aside, looking for anything unusual. Then, as he pulled back the curtains, something caught his eye. "Maggie, come here," he called, his voice sharper now. Maggie stepped closer, her heart thudding loudly in her ears. The officer pointed to a small device tucked into the corner of the window frame. It was a tiny camera, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Her stomach dropped as the officer reached for it, removing it with careful precision. "We've found one," he said grimly. "Let's check the rest of the room." They continued their search, uncovering 2 more hidden cameras, one tucked behind her bookshelf and another cleverly disguised as part of her clock. Each discovery sent waves of nausea through Maggie as she realized just how deep this invasion of her privacy went. "Do you know how long these have been here?" the officer asked, turning to Maggie. "No, I didn't even know they were there," she replied, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. After collecting the evidence, the officers assured Maggie and her parents that they would investigate further and would do everything in their power to find out who was responsible. "We'll need to ask you a few more questions," one officer said, his demeanor serious but compassionate, "and we'll also increase patrols around your neighborhood." As the police left, Maggie felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had thought she was safe after what happened with Jason, but this felt like an even darker reality. "Maggie, you're strong. You'll get through this," her dad said, trying to reassure her. But as she lay in bed that night, the shadows felt more menacing than ever. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of who could be watching her. With each creak of the house settling, Maggie felt the unseen eyes upon her once again. Maria lay in bed, her heart still racing from the day's events. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep within her, a tight knot in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. The weight of what Maggie had experienced felt like a shadow looming over her. She had done her best to stay strong for her friend, but now, lying alone in her darkened room, her mind spun with worry and fear. As she shifted under the covers, trying to find a comfortable position, a chill ran through the air. The night felt unusually heavy, and the silence was deafening. Maria closed her eyes, willing herself to drift off to sleep, but just as she began to relax, a voice sliced through the stillness. "I know what you did." The voice was low and raspy, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up her spine. Maria's eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. "What? Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. She sat up, scanning her room for any sign of the intruder. "Where are you?" she shouted, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. The darkness seemed to thicken around her, the shadows shifting in a way that made her skin crawl. "Listen to me now, freak. We're going to find you, and we're going to get you locked away for a long, long time," she declared, her fear morphing into fierce determination. She had to protect herself and Maggie. They had come too far to let fear take hold now. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, adrenaline surging through her veins. In the corner of her room, a glint of metal caught her eye, the baseball bat her dad had bought her for protection. She grabbed it, feeling its weight reassuring in her hands. "Show yourself," Maria yelled, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling inside her. She began to smash everything in sight, her stuffed animals, her desk lamp, and the clutter that had accumulated over the years. Each crack and shatter released some of the pent-up fear that threatened to swallow her whole. "Mari, what are you doing?" Her mother's voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door swung open, revealing her parents, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. "Making enemies!" Maria shouted back, swinging the bat at her desk, sending papers flying and knocking over a few books. Her heart raced with each swing as the chaos of her room mirrored the turmoil inside her. "Stop! Stop right now!" her dad shouted, rushing in and grabbing the bat from her hands. "What's going on? I heard someone! Someone's in my room!" she gasped, her breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts. She was still trembling, adrenaline coursing through her as she tried to explain. "What do you mean? Did you see someone?" her mom asked, concern etched on her face. Maria lay in bed, her heart still racing from the day's events. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep within her, a tight knot in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. The weight of what Maggie had experienced felt like a shadow looming over her. She had done her best to stay strong for her friend, but now, lying alone in her darkened room, her mind spun with worry and fear. As she shifted under the covers, trying to find a comfortable position, a chill ran through the air. The night felt unusually heavy, and the silence was deafening. Maria closed her eyes, willing herself to drift off to sleep, but just as she began to relax, a voice sliced through the stillness. "I know what you did." The voice was low and raspy, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up her spine. Maria's eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. "What? Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. She sat up, scanning her room for any sign of the intruder. "Where are you?" she shouted, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. The darkness seemed to thicken around her, the shadows shifting in a way that made her skin crawl. "Listen to me now, freak. We're going to find you, and we're going to get you locked away for a long, long time," she declared, her fear morphing into fierce determination. She had to protect herself and Maggie. They had come too far to let fear take hold now. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, adrenaline surging through her veins. In the corner of her room, a glint of metal caught her eye, the baseball bat her dad had bought her for protection. She grabbed it, feeling its weight reassuring in her hands. "Show yourself," Maria yelled, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling inside her. She began to smash everything in sight, her stuffed animals, her desk lamp, and the clutter that had accumulated over the years. Each crack and shatter released some of the pent-up fear that threatened to swallow her whole. "Mari, what are you doing?" Her mother's voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door swung open, revealing her parents, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. "Making enemies!" Maria shouted back, swinging the bat at her desk, sending papers flying and knocking over a few books. Her heart raced with each swing as the chaos of her room mirrored the turmoil inside her. "Stop! Stop right now!" her dad shouted, rushing in and grabbing the bat from her hands. "What's going on? I heard someone! Someone's in my room!" she gasped, her breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts. She was still trembling, adrenaline coursing through her as she tried to explain. "What do you mean? Did you see someone?" her mom asked, concern etched on her face. The sun shone brightly the next day, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, but the light did little to brighten the spirits of Maggie and Maria. They met at their usual spot, a small park a few blocks from their homes, where the laughter and chatter of other kids felt like a distant memory. The tension between them was palpable, and they settled onto a bench, exchanging worried glances. "Someone is trying to scare us," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud would give it more power. She fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, her mind replaying the unsettling events of the past few days. Maria nodded, her expression serious. "It's working," she replied, rubbing her arms as if to ward off an invisible chill. "I can't sleep, Maggie. I keep thinking about that voice. What if it's someone we know? What if they know everything?" The weight of uncertainty hung heavily in the air between them. They had no leads, no suspects, and the feeling of being hunted gnawed at their insides. The police had promised to investigate the cameras and the speaker found in their rooms, but with each passing hour, the hope of finding answers faded. "Maybe we should just lay low," Maria suggested, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree. Keep to ourselves until the police figure this out. But Maggie wasn't convinced. No, she said firmly, a spark igniting in her eyes. We can't just hide. We need to take control of this. What if the police can't find anything? We have to do something. What do you mean? Maria asked, intrigued but cautious. Maggie's mind raced with possibilities, and then it hit her, an idea that seemed crazy yet exhilarating. What if we go visit Jason in the detention center? She proposed. He's the only one who might know what's really going on. Maybe he can give us some answers. Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious? You want to talk to him? After everything? I know it sounds risky, but he's locked up. He can't hurt us. If he really was involved in everything that's happened, maybe he'll slip up and give us a clue, Maggie argued, her determination clear. After a moment of hesitation, Maria nodded, though her expression was a mix of fear and reluctant agreement. I guess we can't keep running scared, but if we do this, we need to be smart about it. We can't let him know we're afraid. Agreed, Maggie said, feeling a rush of adrenaline at the prospect of taking action. We'll go together. We'll stay calm and collected, and we'll get the information we need. As they made their plans, the girls felt a surge of resolve. They would confront Jason and demand answers. They weren't going to let fear dictate their lives any longer. Later that afternoon, they arrived at the detention center, the imposing building casting long shadows that seemed to echo their own trepidation. The air was thick with tension as they approached the entrance, but they pressed on, holding on to the hope that maybe they could turn the tables on whoever was tormenting them. Once inside, they were led through a series of locked doors, each click of the locks sending shivers down their spines. Finally, they were ushered into a stark visiting room, the kind that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a place for conversation. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Jason sat on the opposite side of a glass partition, his expression unreadable as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The boy who had terrorized them now appeared disinterested, his demeanor shifting from arrogance to something more guarded as he saw the two girls enter. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat, eyes narrowing as he assessed their presence. Maggie took a deep breath, her heart racing as she met his gaze. "We want to know what's going on," she said, her voice steady despite the unease swirling inside her. "Someone's been watching us, and we think it's connected to you." Jason chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "You think I'm behind this? You really are delusional," he scoffed. Maria leaned in, her tone sharper. "Cut the act, Jason. We know you've been involved with the cameras and everything else. Just tell us what you know." He leaned forward, the flicker of intrigue lighting up his eyes. "You really think I'm the mastermind behind all this? You've got some nerve coming here, acting like you're the heroes in this story." Maggie pressed on, ignoring his taunts. "Then who is it? We know you're connected. Just tell us. We're not afraid of you anymore." "Fear is a funny thing, isn't it?" Jason replied, a smug grin spreading across his face. "It has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. Maybe you should be more concerned about your own safety." The girls exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of his words weighing heavily on them. "If you know something, you need to tell us," Maria demanded, her voice firm, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her anxiety. Jason leaned back again, seemingly amused. "Whatever you say, detective," he replied, shrugging nonchalantly. "But let's be real. You're in over your heads. You don't know who you're dealing with." Maria felt her frustration boiling over. "I'm going to ask your weirdo family if they know if any of your friends are into watching little girls," she said defiantly. In an instant, Jason's demeanor shifted. "No, stay away from them," he screamed, his eyes wide with panic. The girls looked at each other, confused by his outburst. Then, to their shock, Jason's bravado crumbled. Tears began to stream down his face, his voice cracking as he begged, "Stay away from them. Please, just stay away." He cried like a hurt child, his sobs echoing through the room as if the walls themselves bore witness to his distress. The guards, alerted by the commotion, rushed in, their expressions a mix of concern and authority. Maggie and Maria stood in stunned silence, flabbergasted by the sudden turn of events. They had come to confront Jason, expecting bravado and defiance, but instead, they were met with a breakdown that left them questioning everything they thought they knew about him. The guards escorted the girls out, their minds racing with the implications of what they had just witnessed. As they stepped back into the hallway, the weight of the encounter lingered, casting a shadow over their resolve. "Did that just happen?" Maria whispered, still reeling from the intensity of Jason's reaction. I don't know," Maggie replied, her heart pounding. "But we have to figure this out. If he's scared, then there's something more going on than we realized." As they walked out of the detention center, the echoes of Jason's cries haunted them, a chilling reminder that the truth was far more complex than they had imagined. They had not only confronted a bully, they had glimpsed a broken boy whose actions might stem from a darkness they couldn't begin to understand. "Let's head back and figure out our next move," Maria said, her voice steady despite the unease within her. They were in this together, and they wouldn't stop until they found answers. "Right," Maggie replied, her mind racing with possibilities. They would face whatever came next, side by side, and they would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The events of the detention center still played in their minds like a broken record. Jason's outbursts, the tears, and his desperate cries had left Maggie and Maria with a sense of dread that gnawed at them. What could possibly terrify him so much? They had expected him to sneer and scoff, not fall apart like that. But one thing was certain, Jason's family held secrets, and it was time to find out exactly what those were. "We need to go to his house," Maggie said as they sat on a park bench later that afternoon, still trying to make sense of the day. "Did you see the way he reacted when you mentioned his family? There's something there, Maria. Something he's scared of." Maria bit her lip, her usual confidence shaken. "You think it's safe? I mean, I'm not exactly in the mood for playing detective in front of some creepy rich people." Maggie nodded, though her own nerves were strung tight. "I know, but we have to try. He practically begged us not to go near them. That means something, right?" Maria sighed, standing up and dusting herself off. "Yeah, you're right. But if this goes south, I'm blaming you. Let's just hope we don't get any more surprises." Maggie smiled weakly. "Deal." The girls took a deep breath as they approached the address they had managed to dig up from the internet, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, hidden behind tall iron gates and perfectly manicured hedges. Jason's family estate screamed wealth and power, a far cry from their own middle-class homes. It loomed in front of them like a giant, foreboding presence. Maria, her hand trembling ever so slightly, pressed the button on the gate's intercom. The buzzing noise was harsh, breaking the quiet that surrounded the estate. After a moment, the intercom clicked, but no voice came through. "We're here to talk about Jason," Maria called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to ask some questions." Silence. Maggie and Maria exchanged nervous glances. "Maybe they're not home," Maggie offered, though her gut told her otherwise. Just as they were about to turn away, the heavy iron gates creaked open, swinging wide to reveal the expansive front garden. The driveway was long, bordered by lush greenery and statues that looked like they had been imported from a different century. The entire scene felt like stepping into a different world, a colder, more unsettling one. "Okay, this is already creepy," Maria muttered as they walked past 5 gardeners, all of whom were meticulously tending to the grounds. None of them made eye contact or acknowledged the girls as they passed. Maggie gave a small wave to one of the gardeners, but he continued trimming the hedges as if they weren't even there. "I'm getting weird vibes here," Maria whispered, her voice shaky. "Why aren't they even looking at us? This whole place feels wrong." "Yeah," Maggie agreed, her eyes darting nervously around. "It's like we're not even real to them." They made their way up the massive stone steps to the front door. It was as grand as the rest of the estate, with intricate carvings that looked older than time itself. Just as they reached for the doorbell, it opened. A tall, well-dressed man in a perfectly tailored black suit stood in the doorway, his expression neutral, almost robotic. He was clearly the butler. "Good afternoon, Miss Maggie, Miss Maria," he said in a crisp, measured tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Darcy have been expecting you." Maria blinked, taken aback. "Expecting us?" she echoed, her voice laced with confusion. They hadn't called ahead, hadn't told anyone they were coming. How could they have known? The butler stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Maggie and Maria exchanged a quick look. Something was off. More than off. This whole place reeked of something dark, something unsettling. I don't like this, Maria whispered under her breath as they stepped into the grand foyer. The mansion's interior was even more imposing than the outside. Gleaming floors stretched out in every direction, and the walls were lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following the girls as they moved. "I'm with you," Maggie whispered back, glancing around nervously. "They better not be vampires." Maria snorted, the tension breaking for a brief moment, but the unease returned almost immediately. The butler led them through the entryway into a massive sitting room, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a home. There were velvet couches, golden candelabras, and an eerie silence that seemed to seep into their bones. "Please wait here," the butler instructed. "Mr. and Mrs. Darcy will join you shortly." And with that, he disappeared, leaving the girls standing awkwardly in the center of the opulent room. Maria looked around, her eyes wide. "Okay, this is officially the weirdest place I've ever been. How do people live in houses like this? It's like we're in a movie or something." "I know," Maggie agreed, her gaze drifting over the ornate furnishings. "But we need to stay focused. We're here for answers. No matter how creepy this place is, we can't let them scare us." Maria nodded, though she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear out of the shadows. Minutes passed, and the silence grew more oppressive. The girls shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the mansion pressing down on them. "Do you think they're actually going to come?" Maria asked, breaking the silence. Maggie shrugged, though she didn't feel as confident as she tried to appear. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." Just as the words left her mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room swung open with a creak, and in walked Mr. and Mrs. Darcy. They were exactly what the girls had expected, dressed in designer clothes, with an air of wealth and power that seemed to fill the room. But there was something else, something darker behind their polished exteriors. It was in the way they moved, the way their eyes lingered on the girls just a little too long. "Welcome," Mrs. Darcy said, her voice smooth and controlled, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We've been looking forward to this conversation." Maggie and Maria exchanged a glance, their unease growing by the second. They had come for answers, but standing in front of Jason's parents, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover far more than they had bargained for. The tension in the room was palpable as Jason's parents stood before Maggie and Maria, their polished, overly perfect smiles masking something far more sinister. The girls hadn't known what to expect, but this unsettling air of control was worse than any confrontation they had imagined. "We were wondering when you'd finally come," Mr. Darcy said, his voice smooth and unbothered, as though they were simply discussing the weather. Maggie narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "No reason," Mrs. Darcy responded quickly, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that made the girl's skin crawl. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as the Darcys gestured for them to sit. A lavish cheese board was placed on the glass coffee table in front of them, featuring an array of the most expensive cheeses in the world, some of which the girls couldn't even pronounce. "Please, help yourselves," Mrs. Darcy said, her voice unnervingly calm as she smiled in their direction. The smile never quite reached her eyes. Maria, her stomach rumbling despite her nerves, reached for a small slice of cheese, but Maggie quickly grabbed her wrist, stopping her. "No," Maggie whispered sharply, her eyes darting toward Mrs. Darcy, who stood watching them with that same eerie smile. "You don't like cheese, darling?" Mrs. Darcy asked, her voice sugary sweet, though the question dripped with something darker. "No, thank you," Maggie responded, her voice firm, but her heart raced. Mrs. Darcy's smile widened, but it didn't touch her eyes. "Ah, too young to appreciate the finer things in life, I see." "Would you care for some wine, then?" Mr. Darcy asked, as if offering them juice or soda. Maria furrowed her brow. "We're only 12, we can't drink." Mr. Darcy chuckled, a dark undertone beneath his voice. "Of course you can. We won't tell if you don't." The pressure in the room was mounting, and despite her initial hesitation, Maria felt trapped. With shaking hands, both girls took a sip from the glasses that had been placed in front of them. The bitter, sour taste of the wine immediately hit their tongues, causing them to grimace. They weren't ready for the sharp bite of alcohol, their young taste buds rejecting the experience entirely. "Why are you here?" Mr. Darcy asked, his tone shifting to one of thinly veiled impatience. Maggie swallowed hard, trying to push down the bitter taste of the wine and the even more bitter feeling of dread rising in her chest. "We need to know if you have any information on your son's activities, or any of his bad connections." Mrs. Darcy's expression never faltered as she leaned back in her chair, resting one arm lazily across the backrest. "Our boy? Oh, he's a little sweetheart. He wouldn't hurt a fly." Maria's hands tightened into fists at her sides, her fear giving way to frustration. "Your sweet little boy spat on us, hit us, and made our lives hell with his friends. He's no sweetheart." Mrs. Darcy's eyes flickered for the briefest second, but her smile only widened. "Boys will be boys," she said dismissively, her tone dripping with arrogance. The room felt colder suddenly, the kind of cold that crawled beneath the skin and settled in your bones. Maria's vision blurred for a moment, the edges of the room swirling. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but it felt as if her thoughts were swimming in mud. Maggie wasn't faring much better. She could feel her limbs growing heavier, her movements sluggish. Something was wrong. "Why won't you just drop it?" Mr. Darcy's voice cut through the fog that was slowly creeping into their minds. The girls could barely hear him as their heads started to pound, their hearing fuzzy. "Move on with your life like nothing happened." Maggie tried to speak, but her words were slurred, like they were sinking beneath thick water. She looked at Maria, whose eyes were now half closed, her body slumping forward in the chair. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't focus enough to act. "We're not tired," Maria muttered, her words barely intelligible as she fought to stay conscious. Mrs. Darcy tilted her head, watching them like a predator observing its prey, a slow smile creeping across her lips. "Oh, but you are, sweet girls. You're awfully tired. Why don't you let the butler show you to bed?" As if on cue, the butler appeared, standing silently behind them. His presence was menacing, though he made no sound. Maggie's vision was swimming now, her limbs too heavy to move. She tried to shake off the fog clouding her mind, but it was no use. With the last bit of energy she could muster, Maggie shot Maria a desperate glance, but it was too late. The world around them faded into black, their bodies slipping into unconsciousness. When Maggie woke up, she was staring at the ceiling of her own bedroom. The familiar posters on her walls, the stuffed animals on her dresser, all of it was normal. But as she sat up, her heart racing, her hands shook uncontrollably. It couldn't have been a dream. She could still taste the wine, feel the dread clinging to her skin. A soft knock at her window startled her, and she rushed over to open it. Maria stood outside on her lawn, her eyes wide with fear. "I had the weirdest dream," Maria whispered. Maggie stared at her, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, you didn't." The color drained from Maria's face. "What do you mean?" Maggie swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she answered. "Because I had the same one." Maggie and Maria exchanged determined glances as they reached the high iron gate of the Darcy mansion. The overwhelming confusion from their strange encounter the previous day still clung to them like a dark cloud. They needed answers, and they weren't about to let the odd events at the Darcys go unanswered. The gate was closed, but they buzzed, pressing the intercom button and waiting impatiently for a response. Silence. No buzz of electricity, no voice crackling through the speaker. Maggie pressed the button again, more aggressively this time. Still nothing. "Maybe they're not home," Maria suggested. "They were expecting us yesterday. Now they won't even answer the door?" Maggie said, irritation rising in her voice. They peeked through the bars of the gate and over the towering hedges, straining to see any movement, but it was eerily quiet. The gardeners they'd seen the day before were gone. The cleaners who had bustled around the front yard were nowhere to be found. It was as if the estate had been abandoned overnight. "I don't like this." Maria took a step back from the gate, a chill running up her spine. "Where did everybody go?" "Let's try the side," Maggie suggested, her voice low. They moved to the side of the estate, walking along the tall hedge that lined the massive property. The further they walked, the more unnerved they felt by the complete lack of life inside the estate. It was as if the Darcys had vanished, leaving behind nothing but that unsettling quiet. After circling the perimeter with no luck, the girls headed back toward the street, still uneasy and unsatisfied. "Something's off about this place," Maggie muttered as they walked. "It's like they knew we were coming back." Maria glanced around nervously. "And that weird dream, how do we both remember the same thing?" She scratched her head. "That wasn't a dream, was it? But how did we end up back home?" Maggie shrugged, trying to make sense of it. "Maybe." A sudden screech of tires cut her off. A car had pulled up beside them out of nowhere, its engine rumbling ominously. "Get in!" a man's voice barked from inside. The girls froze for half a second, their instincts screaming danger. Without another word, they turned and bolted in the opposite direction, their legs pumping as fast as they could. They didn't dare look back, only focusing on the escape ahead of them. They zigzagged through side streets, hoping to lose the car. Their hearts pounded, adrenaline surging through their veins as they thought they had managed to shake the vehicle. But just as they turned a corner, the car reappeared, screeching to a stop in front of them. Maggie screamed as a man jumped out and grabbed her, his grip rough and strong. She struggled, kicking and flailing as he pulled her toward the car. "Let me go!" Maria shouted, trying to yank Maggie free, but another man appeared from the other side and grabbed her. They were both thrown into the back seat of the car, the door slamming shut behind them. Panic surged through them as they screamed and cried, kicking at the seats in front of them in a desperate attempt to escape. In the front seat, the man behind the wheel turned around. "Hello, girls." It took a second for the girls to recognize him, but when they did, their blood ran cold. "The butler?" Maggie whispered, her voice trembling with shock. He wasn't wearing his usual uniform, but his face, his voice, it was unmistakable. The butler gave them a calm, almost chilling smile. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" Maria shouted, her voice cracking with fear. The butler met her eyes through the rearview mirror, his smile never faltering. "We have to talk," he said simply. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, as the girls struggled to comprehend the situation. Their hearts raced, the fear still fresh from being dragged into the car by a man they thought was their enemy. But now he was calmly driving, eyes focused on the road ahead, the tension hanging heavy. "Calm," the butler, no, Michael McDonough, said in a steady, authoritative tone. "I'm not who you think I am." Maggie and Maria exchanged frantic glances, still trembling. "My name is FBI agent Michael McDonough. I've been undercover for the last 2 years, trying to bring down the Darcy family," he explained, his voice low but serious. The girls blinked in disbelief, their minds spinning. "What?" Maggie muttered, her voice small. Maria shook her head, her hands shaking as she clutched the seat in front of her. "Why are you telling us this? We're 12. Go to the police or something." Michael glanced at them through the rearview mirror, his expression grave. "Girls, the police here are all bought out, every single one of them." The girls fell silent, their eyes widening. Michael continued, "Why do you think it took you both literally recording Jason Darcy assaulting you before the police did anything? The evidence was right in front of them, but even then, they stalled. None of them can be trusted." Maria gasped softly, while Maggie bit her lip, staring out the window as they passed familiar streets. Deep down, something about what Michael was saying made sense. They had both sensed something off about the police's reluctance to act, how long it had taken for them to get justice. "Well, what do you want us to do about it?" Maggie blurted out, a nervous laugh slipping from her lips, as she tried to make sense of the absurdity of an FBI agent enlisting 2 12-year-olds. "We're just kids." Michael's tone grew serious, the weight of his words sinking in. "Listen closely, girls. It's very important that you listen to me right now." He paused, waiting for their full attention. "Those cameras in the girls' locker room, in the bathroom, in your bedrooms, they were all put there by the Darcys." Maria's face twisted in shock. "What?" "They record the daughters of the men and women of this town in vulnerable places," Michael explained. "They take photos and videos and then use those recordings to blackmail their parents, force them to do whatever the Darcys want. Did you see all their gardeners and cleaners at the mansion? Most of them are parents who've been blackmailed, forced to work for pennies. They do it because if they don't, the Darcys threaten to leak those photos and videos of their little girls." It's vile. They're absolutely vile. The girls sat in stunned silence. It was like hearing the most twisted horror story come to life, one so evil they could barely wrap their minds around it. Maggie's mouth was dry. She couldn't finish her sentence. Maria was speechless, her stomach churning. Then, after a few moments, she found her voice. "So, why haven't you caught them yet?" she asked, her tone cautious, almost scared to hear the answer. Michael chuckled darkly. "Because they may be evil, but they're geniuses. They're careful, too careful. They keep every piece of incriminating information locked away, and they don't say a word around me or any of the other staff. The only reason we even know about what they're doing is from parents who've come forward, but none of them will testify because of the blackmail." The girls sat in disbelief, unable to process the sheer scope of it. The Darcys had this entire town under their thumb. Every parent, every worker, all controlled by threats and fear. Maria's brow furrowed as she stared at Michael. "I don't think you fully understand something here. We're only 12, she said, her voice dry, but with a hint of defiance. Maggie sat next to her, mirroring the same blank, shocked expression. Michael glanced back at them, his voice softening just slightly. "Yes, I know, but you're the only people to have ever hurt them. When you put Jason away, it was the first time I've ever seen them rattled, stressed. They're used to being in control. They hate when they lose it." Maggie's mouth hung open. "We did that?" Michael nodded. "Jason, he was a sweet kid when I first met him, but his parents, especially his dad, they beat him, forced him to do all of this. He's terrified of them. And between you and me," Michael lowered his voice, "he's better off locked away, far from them." The girls exchanged another shocked look. Jason, the boy who had spat on them, tormented them, was also a victim of his own parents' cruelty. It was a revelation that hit them hard, confusing their feelings even further. "But he did all those awful things to us," Maria muttered, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images of Jason, the bully and the scared boy Michael described. "I'm not saying he's innocent. What he did was wrong, horribly wrong," Michael said. "But trust me, the real monsters are his parents." The car continued down the street in tense silence. Maggie and Maria sat quietly, their minds reeling from everything they had just learned. There was no going back now, no pretending that life would return to normal. "What now?" Maggie finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Now we take them down for good." The tires screeched to a stop outside of Maggie's house first, then Maria's. The girls stepped out of the car in a daze, Michael's words still ringing in their ears. "So everyone who works for the Darcys is basically a slave?" Maria asked, wide-eyed, as she tugged her backpack over her shoulder. Michael nodded, leaning out of the driver's side window. "In a way, yes. They control everyone through fear." He reached into the glove box and handed each girl a brand new phone. "These are for contacting me only. Don't use them for anything else. And one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 shiny black credit cards, handing one to each girl. "FBI funded, unlimited. But be careful. This is for emergencies or if you need anything while we plan. Got it?" The girls stared at the cards, their eyes as big as saucers. Unlimited money? They couldn't help but grin, like they had just won the lottery. "Wait for my instructions. Stay safe." Michael added before driving off, leaving the 2 girls standing outside their houses, clutching their new phones and credit cards, struggling to process everything that had just happened. Maggie turned to Maria, her grin widening. "Okay, so, what's the most responsible thing we can do with this money?" Maria grinned back, and without a word, they bolted toward the nearest mall, laughing like only 2 12-year-olds could. The mall was buzzing with weekend activity, kids running around, shoppers rushing between stores, and the smell of food wafting through the air. Maggie and Maria, armed with their new credit cards, dashed from one store to another, their arms slowly filling up with bags of clothes, gadgets, and more food than they could eat. "Okay, we definitely need that," Maggie said, pointing to a ridiculously expensive handbag. "We don't need that, Maggie," Maria laughed, shaking her head. "But it would look cool." As they strolled through the food court, ice cream cones in hand, they spotted 2 girls around their age, hanging out and laughing just like they were. The girls were twins, with matching chestnut braids and wide, friendly smiles. They waved and approached Maggie and Maria. "Hey, don't you guys go to our school?" one of them asked, smiling. Maggie nodded. "Yeah, we do. You're the twins, right? Jenny and Penny?" The girls beamed. "That's us! We've seen you around, but never really got the chance to talk." The four girls found a table and sat down, sharing stories and jokes like old friends. The twins had a playful energy, and within minutes, Maggie and Maria were laughing at their stories about pulling harmless pranks on their teachers or sneaking extra snacks into their backpacks. "So what have you guys been up to today?" Penny asked, digging into her ice cream. "Looks like you've been on quite the shopping spree." Maggie and Maria exchanged a grin. "Yeah, we've been treating ourselves," Maria replied, trying not to sound too suspicious. "Needed a little pick-me-up after all the crazy stuff lately." Jenny and Penny leaned in, their faces curious. "Crazy stuff? Like what?" Maggie paused, realizing she didn't want to give too much away just yet. School drama, weird stuff." Jenny nodded. "Yeah, school's been weird for us too. Our parents are acting super strange." Maggie's ears perked up. "Strange how?" Penny shrugged. "They've been coming home late every night. They won't say why. They work for the Darcys, and it's like they're never around anymore." Maggie and Maria exchanged quick glances. Darcy workers. Could Jenny and Penny's parents be part of the twisted blackmail scheme Michael had told them about? Maggie leaned in slightly. "That does sound weird. What do they do for the Darcys?" Jenny rolled her eyes. "They're gardeners. They've been working for them for years, but lately it's like they live at that estate." Maria's mind raced. This could be their chance. If they could get close to the twins' parents, maybe they could find out more about what was happening on the Darcy estate. Before Maria could say anything, Penny smiled brightly and said, "Hey, you two should come over for a sleepover sometime. We've got a huge house, and we could hang out all night." Maggie felt her heart race. This was it, the perfect opportunity to get inside without raising suspicion. She glanced at Maria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yeah, that sounds awesome," Maggie replied, keeping her voice casual. "When do you want us to come over?" Jenny clapped her hands together. "How about next weekend? Our parents will be at work, and we can have the house all to ourselves." Maria grinned. "Perfect." As the twins rambled on about the sleepover, Maggie and Maria's minds were already racing with plans. Once they got into that house, they would sneak out of the room when the twins were asleep and talk to their parents. Maybe, just maybe, they could find out what the Darcys were really up to. For now, though, they played it cool, enjoying their time at the mall, eating way too much ice cream and cracking jokes about the silliest things. The weight of what they were doing, what they were involved in, faded into the background for just a little while. But in the back of their minds, they knew that this sleepover could be the key to unlocking everything. The night of the sleepover arrived, and Maggie and Maria, though nervous, were prepared. They packed their bags carefully, making sure to have their new FBI-issued phones hidden away, just in case something happened. The twins greeted them with big smiles as soon as they arrived. "You're here! We've been waiting for you guys all day!" Jenny exclaimed, pulling them inside. The four girls spent the evening playing games, laughing, and eating snacks until their stomachs hurt. Despite everything Maggie and Maria knew, it was hard not to get lost in the fun and forget, just for a while, about the dark secret lurking underneath the Darcy estate. They played truth or dare, tried to tell spooky stories, and even had a pillow fight that left feathers flying everywhere. Around 11 p.m., the energy began to wind down. The twins yawned, stretching their arms. "I think it's time for bed," Penny suggested, rubbing her tired eyes. "Yeah, it's getting late." Maggie agreed, trying to hide her anticipation. "But this has been fun." They all changed into their pajamas and crawled into their sleeping bags in the large, cozy room the twins shared. Maggie and Maria lay side by side, their hearts racing as they pretended to settle in. They weren't here for sleep. They were here for answers. About 2 hours later, just as they were starting to feel the pull of sleep, Maggie heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing downstairs. Her eyes snapped open. She nudged Maria gently. "They're back," Maggie whispered. Maria blinked the sleep from her eyes and nodded. Silently, the two girls slipped out of their sleeping bags and grabbed their phones. They dimmed the light to barely a glow, just enough to see where they were going without waking the twins. They tiptoed through the hallways, careful not to make a sound. The house was large, the kind where footsteps could echo if they weren't careful. As they crept downstairs, they heard voices coming from the kitchen. Maggie and Maria exchanged a look, then inched closer to the partially closed kitchen door. They huddled just outside the door, pressing their backs against the wall, straining to hear what the twins' parents were saying. "We can't keep doing this. We need to fight," came the voice of Jenny and Penny's mother, Catherine. "What fight, Catherine?" the father replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. "They have pictures of our daughter. If we try anything, they'll release those photos. Can you live with that?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. Photos of their daughter? It was true. The Darcys had blackmail on them, just like Michael had said. Maggie's grip on her phone tightened. They had to hear more. But before they could shift closer, Maria's elbow accidentally knocked into the door, sending it open with a creak. She stumbled through the doorway and froze, wide-eyed. Jenny and Penny's parents turned around, startled. "What are you doing down here, girls?" Catherine asked, her voice tense but calm. Maria quickly tried to recover, brushing off her clothes as if she'd just tripped. We were thirsty, wanted to grab some water. But Maggie had enough of the games. She stepped forward, her expression serious. "We know the truth." The twins' parents exchanged nervous glances. The air in the room felt thick with tension. "What truth?" their father asked, but his voice lacked conviction. Maggie crossed her arms, her face set with determination. "We know everything. About the Darcys. About what they're doing to you. We know they've been blackmailing you, and we know why." The parents tried to deny it at first, exchanging panicked looks as they stammered half-hearted excuses. But Maggie didn't budge, and neither did Maria. "Stop lying," Maggie demanded, her voice sharper now. "We already know about the blackmail. We know how they've been using the cameras to trap people in this town." Catherine's eyes welled up with tears. She slumped into a chair, her face etched with defeat. "How do you know all of this?" Maggie didn't flinch. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is we're trying to stop them." Finally, the twins' parents caved. They confessed, telling the girls everything they knew. They described how the Darcys had forced them into working for them, how they lived in constant fear of the photos being leaked, and how powerless they felt. "We're trapped," the father admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "We can't fight them. We've tried, but the Darcys have too much power." Catherine wiped a tear from her cheek. "Please don't tell Jenny and Penny. They can't know. They'd never understand, and I don't want them to feel like they're in danger." Maggie and Maria exchanged a look. They understood the parents' desperation, but they also knew they couldn't leave without getting something in return. "We won't tell the twins," Maggie said firmly, "but we need you to help us first." The parents looked at each other, then back at the girls. "What do you need?" Catherine asked, her voice heavy with dread. Maggie's eyes darkened with resolve. "We need you to get us into the Darcy house." The room fell silent as the weight of Maggie's words sank in. The parents stared at the two girls, their faces pale with fear, but they knew they had no choice. "Okay," the father whispered, "we'll help." That's the end of part 1 of Maggie and Maria's story. Part 2 is going to pop up on screen, so be sure to click that if you want to find out what happens next. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of love and care into telling these important stories, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Have a blessed day.